Council meeting of April 15th to order. We'll stand and say the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All individuals are asked to either silence or turn off cell phones, pagers, and other electronic devices that may disrupt the meeting. Approval of the agenda. Approve the agenda as posted in accordance with the open meeting law and herein place all agenda items on the table for discussion. What's the wish of the council?
Motion to approve the agenda.
I'll second it.
Motion by Councilmember Storley, second by Councilmember Goshek. Any discussion? All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Approval of the minutes. Minutes from the special work session meeting of April 1st, 2019, and the regular meeting of April 1st, 2019. Approve.
Motion to approve the minutes is recorded.
Second.
Motion by Councilmember Storley, second by Councilmember Hansen. Any discussion?
Mr. President, I will be abstaining since I was not here at the meeting.
All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Approval of the bills. Checks 100363 through 100453, totaling $309,773.34. Approve. What's the wish of the council?
I'll make a motion to approve the bills.
Second.
Motion by Councilmember Goshek, second by Councilmember Knopfler. Any discussion? All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Awards, donations, presentations, and proclamations. Proclamation, Richard Howard Farrell Post 46, American Legion Day, 100 years. Mayor Zoka.
Okay, I'm going to read the proclamation. Whereas the American Legion was chartered by Congress the 16th day of 1919 as a wartime veterans organization based on the 4 pillars of Veterans Affairs: rehabilitation, national security, Americanism, and children and youth. And whereas over the years, the American Legion has become a preeminent community service organization which now numbers more than 2.5 million members, men and women, and over 14,000 American Legion posts worldwide, working a variety of programs that support the 4 pillars and benefits our nation's veterans, its service members, their families, the youth of America, and its citizens. And whereas the members of the American Legion are dedicated to upholding the ideals of freedom and democracy while working to make a difference in the lives of fellow Americans, and whereas April 19th, 2019 marks the 100th anniversary of Richard Howard Farrell Post 46, the observance of American Legion Day provides an opportunity to recognize Legionnaires in our community for their many contributions to our community. Now, therefore, I, Gregory J. Zilka, Mayor of the City of Little Falls, do hereby proclaim April 19th, 2019 as Richard Howard Farrell Post 46 American Legion Day in Little Falls, and urge all residents to recognize and thank all of our servicemen and women and their families for their dedication to our communities. Signed this 15th day of April, 2019. Guys, would you come up here for a picture, please?
sit there and smile for them.
Presentation, Camp Ripley Economic Impact and Update. Brigadier General Cruz. Thank you.
So good evening, Mayor, Councilman, members. I'm Lowell Cruz. I'm joined tonight by Chief Shane Hagen. He works for me in my JVB. And tonight we want to just go over a quick slide deck of a dozen slides or so and kind of give you an update of what's happened at Camp Ripley this last year and what we expect to happen here this summer and over the fall. And just in our effort to communicate to you and be the best neighbor we can. So next slide, please. So my mission statement hasn't changed. I'm tasked with providing the best support facilities for your National Guard and other agency customers to come and provide the best environment there they can meet their training requirements, while I maintain the best positive community relations I can and try to be the best neighbor we can. And I'm pretty proud that we were able to balance those missions and on a day-to-day basis do a pretty good job doing both. Next slide. So last year when I came and spoke to you, it was kind of a new changeover in leadership. I talked about the fact that General Jensen had taken over as the Adjutant General and that I was the new Senior Commander at Camp Ripley. We also introduced you to Colonel Brian Melton. Colonel Melton has spent the last year deployed to Jordan as part of the 34th Infantry Division's deployment to CENTCOM. Most of the division is headquartered down in Kuwait. But we've got a portion that's up in Jordan supporting the fight against ISIS, and Colonel Melton is part of that team there. And so we've been without a garrison commander through the summer. The garrison commander commands the unit that is assigned to help me run Camp Ripley. I've got a lot of full-time employees that work there Monday through Friday, but I also have a guard unit that's assigned to the base, and Colonel Melton's its commander. And then finally, I share a CSM with Colonel Melton and Matt Erickson. Matt's starting his third year now as our CSM, and we'll probably be introducing you to a new CSM next spring when I return. So, next slide. So in 2018, we saw a very similar economic impact to the community compared to other years. The total impact was probably down a little bit, but we continue to average around that $290,000 to $300,000 or $300 million total impact, and the real fluctuation there is tied to any kind of huge or large construction projects that we are funding at any one time on the installation. And follow-on slides will kind of give you an update on some of those pieces. But the majority of our wages continue to be payroll and the payroll for our DOD military retirees, some of which are the proud members of Legion Group 46 that we just gave a proclamation to. So next slide. So in 2018, we had almost 400,000 man days of soldiers training at Camp Ripley. A man day is one soldier for one day. But we also had 56,000 man days of state agency and civilians training there. And if we had one, continuing theme that I would give you is that our state agency partners and civilians have found Camp Ripley to be a very cost-effective place for them to come and do training, to do a lot of their conferences, those kind of things. And I tell people Camp Ripley used to be very busy in the summer with National Guard training, and winter we would spend a lot of time in our winter just maybe seeing 1 or 2 weekends where we were very busy. We are busy all the time now, and that during the week training in the middle of the winter is really filled up with our civilian agency partners. The State Patrol's academy is occurring right now. They've got one of their largest academy classes they've had in a long time there. We also took pride in our environmental program again this last year. We were recognized as the DOD winner for cultural resource management. they got that recognition for a couple different aspects of their program. The first part was that we have completed a complete phase 1 survey of all 56,000 acres of Camp Ripley. And what that means is we have a good idea of every acre that contains some kind of significant cultural entity, be it a Indian burial mound to a farmstead to other items that we know that we have to protect culturally. Why that's important is now whenever I do a building project or some kind of construction, I don't have to go through the first step, which is to meet with the SHPO, the State Historical Society, for that cultural clearance, which is very important to us. They also were recognized with their efforts of preserving the Indian burial mounds along the Mississippi River. We have several of them, and we actively consult with our Native American tribal partners on those, as well as some effort in trying to maintain the heritage surrounding Old Fort Ripley and that site. So very prestigious award again for our environmental team, and the fact that we were able to compete all the way up to the DOD level and win is a pretty big special piece for us. We also hosted several brigade-size elements throughout the summer. This was the second year in a row we've hosted the 88th Training Division's combat support exercise. And what that is there's they host about 5,000 logisticians at Fort McCoy, and we had another 1,500 at Camp Ripley this summer for about a 3-week period. And they spent a lot of time exercising the long lines of communication between here and Fort McCoy and sending convoys over the roads and things back and forth. So all the supplies for those 1,500 soldiers that we had at Ripley in August of last year were trucked every day from Fort McCoy in an effort to replicate some of that supply level activity that they rarely get to get a chance to conduct over long distances. We also hosted the Swedish Army Chief of Staff, General Ingelbertsen. I got to meet him last May, and we had the Croatian ambassador at Ripley as well. So a typically busy year for us. We logged probably 3-4 national level dignities like that a year, as well as some pretty impressive training. So next slide. Our construction, last year when I was here, I talked about the tornado we'd had in 2016 and how we were starting to see buildings, at least the foundations appear. Well, those buildings are about done. By the end of May here, it says August, but the majority of the construction will be done here by the end of May on those 4 major buildings that were the biggest damage, that we basically tore the building completely down and rebuilt it up. We're also in the process of probably a 5 to 10-year plan of replacing all our tin huts on the installation. And the replacement for them are the picture there to the left, which we call longhouses. They're squad bays, basically, 6 to 8 of them in a row with one shared roof. And it gives us each one of them will give us a max capacity between 100 to 200 soldiers. So it'll be a large improvement over the years of staying in a tin hut. So next slide. Some other construction projects on the installation. If you get a chance to come to or use our post-exchange, you'll find that the interior was completely remodeled over the winter. And we're starting some construction projects on some new buildings and some renovation. The first one is what we refer to as the HEM building. It's a large, what was a maintenance building that we had received from one of the, it was donated to the National Guard probably 30 years ago from one of the mine companies. And we're finally renovating that, and that'll be the home of the Camp Ripley Fire Department. We're also adding an addition onto that'll contain the rest of the fire department's admin space and building space. We're creating some new simulations buildings, and we're continuing to upgrade our electrical grid. And the electrical grid right now, we're at the point where we've got the 80-acre solar field that we've talked about. We've got backup generation now at all our substations, and the next phase of that electrical grid upgrade will be tying it all together with a computerized system that will allow us to balance the load between that as we drive towards self-sufficiency in our electricity. Next slide, please. So this coming year, rather than breaking it down by month, I really told the team what I wanted to tell you was give you a feel for what we thought we'd have for a population by month, and then pick out some important pieces of training. So May is a very busy month for us as all the Guard units try to log a lot of their 3 and 4 day IDT weekends. So your National Guard now, by average, trains anywhere between 48 and 68 days, or 60 days a year. And for our Armor Brigade Combat Team, that means that some of those units are doing a 4 and 5 day weekends drill over a month. And so you'll see a lot of that training in May. Why that's important is our tank battalions and our artillery battalions have to get all their qualification done, because we're going to ship them all to Fort Hood, Texas in August. And so they won't be at Camp Ripley for their annual training. Their annual training will be at Fort Hood, Texas, but they got a lot of gunnery they got to do before that. So we'll be fairly loud and noisy neighbor in May, as well as June, as we bring in some other artillery units. And then in July, we've got about 3,000 soldiers coming up from Iowa. The 2nd Brigade Combat Team's coming up from Iowa to do their exportable combat training center training period. So the goal there is they're prepping, and next year the 2nd Brigade and the 1st Brigade both will go to our premier combat training centers. The 2nd Brigade to the one in Mississippi, and the 1st Brigade, the Armor Brigade Combat Team, will go to Fort Irwin to the National Training Center. The year before that, they spend a 3-week AT where they go through, and it's really a replication of all the tasks that they'll have to do at that combat training center. 2nd Brigade will be doing that at Camp Ripley in July. Meanwhile, in July, we'll be loading about 9 trains worth of equipment out of Ripley to send our 1st Brigade to Fort Hood. And they will arrive at Fort Hood the first part of August, and they'll do their annual training down at Fort Hood. And that equipment then will arrive back at Camp Ripley the end of August. As you can see, our civilian numbers kind of fluctuate back and forth, but the fall becomes a very important time for our civilian agencies to do a lot of their training. And with October being a very busy month for us with in-services for the State Patrol, the DNR, and the Conservation Corps, and several other entities like that. Next slide. Meanwhile, in the air, our C-130 wings continue to keep our skies very full of C-130s. If you didn't know, Minnesota has 2 C-130 wings, a guard wing and a reserve, air reserve wing. And those C-130s are continually using Camp Ripley, normally Tuesday through Thursday a lot, but you'll see C-130s flying almost every day. We have a lot of controversy sometimes of just what they're doing, but they spend a lot of time circling the airfield and doing touch and goes on our airfield, as well as they practice dropping GPS-guided pallets that they push out of the back of their airplanes, and those pallets land in one of our drop zones. And so some great training for them. We also have one of the few, we have very few gravel runways in the inventory, and Camp Ripley's got one of them. So we call it an assault strip, and the C-130s practice on that gravel surface as well. And what's important about that is they're prepping to use similar airfields that they'll find in Afghanistan when they're doing that training. And meanwhile, their support services can come up here to use our ranges and a lot of our other facilities as well. So a great relationship with our Air National Guard and Reserve, and a great use of a lot of resources that we have at Ripley that wouldn't get that level of use if they didn't exist. Next slide. So we talk about having permanent partners stationed at Camp Ripley, and I'm lucky to have a slice of the DNR, the State Patrol, Homeland Security Emergency Management, and MnDOT. The DNR and the State Patrol both conduct their law enforcement academies there. The State Patrol started theirs in January. They'll graduate and leave camp here sometime in April. And about a week later, the DNR will start their law enforcement academy as well. So we'll have cadets there from both academies pretty much till about September this fall. Meanwhile, HSEM has an office on post. They continue to do emergency management training in our Emergency Management Training Center. And finally, you've heard a lot you've heard me talk before about our snowplow driving, the training that the DOT does every fall, and makes our fall very busy then. And that's part of those large numbers in October, is all the snowplow drivers that they're bringing up here to train. Next slide. We talked a little bit about it when I talked about the cultural preservation award that was awarded. But if you look at the different awards that our environmental program has and the areas that we focus on, Camp Ripley and the Minnesota National Guard are recognized nationally for the quality of its environmental programs. And more importantly, we have a lot of installations that come here trying to figure out how we can balance our robust military training with the environmental programs that we do have. And it really gives us an advantage when we are able to say, yes, let's try to figure out how to do that, rather than a hard no all the time. So, next slide. Of course, with being a good neighbor, I want to make sure that I'm environmentally sound as well. So what we wanted to talk about here with this slide is just the fact that we have lots of different regulations and regulation agencies that come to the installation and inspect us. From the federal, we've got the EPA, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We've got all sorts of state agencies, and as well as the Army. Love to come and make sure that we're following their guidance and their plans. And my team wouldn't be as award-winning as they are if they weren't all over understanding what compliance looks like inside of that. Next slide. And finally, as a good neighbor, we want to reach out and create partnerships inside of our community. We've got some awesome partnerships with both the college in St. Cloud as well as Central Lakes College in Brainerd. Create a lot of internship relationships in that matter. The Department of Natural Resources and their study at Camp Ripley is incredibly important. Wildlife. We still host a lot of your children in the spring as part of school groups coming to Camp Ripley to learn about conservation and environmental stuff, as well as a chance to climb on some of our tanks in the museum and stuff like that. And finally, the community interest groups here in next month will be part of the May Day event, where we'll come back in the community and add some labor as part of our environmental day there as well. Next slide. And finally, we've got a lot of opportunities for community outreach. I want to highlight the open house in September coming up. The third Sunday in September, it will be our open house. And we've paired it with the reveal of Charles Kapsner's Air Force painting. And so what the theme for our open house this year will be the Minnesota Air National Guard and its support to the Air Force. Charles's painting is the last one to go in the committal hall at the cemetery, highlighting the service of the Air Force. We've asked the Chief of the Air Force to come as our guest speaker. And if not him, then the Chief of National Guard Bureau, which are both 4-star Air Force officers. So we'll see if we get a taker on one of them and how much political pull our Air Force brethren have inside of the game. But truly, it's going to be an opportunity to recognize the service of the Air Force and to culminate a pretty awesome project for the cemetery as well. And you'll see a lot of other events. I was just talking about Earth Day. I was trying to pick that out of the sky, and I said May Day, but we're looking forward to supporting Earth Day coming up here. Spent a lot of time on the road giving speeches for a lot of our different veterans and Memorial Day. And more importantly, our sporting opportunities for our disabled veterans and our soldiers are a highlight for us to highlight every year. In a week or so here, we'll have our disabled veteran turkey hunt again. And so we'll see if we get an appearance again at Bud Grant or not at that. He's joins us almost every year for that. And the Trolling for the Troops event here the first part of June is an important event as well. Next slide. Finally, we started some prescribed burns last Monday and Tuesday, and then we had an interruption on Wednesday. And so, like the rest of the community, we're waiting for our grass to reappear, and then we'll go back to trying to burn off as much of that dead grass as we can. We do that to prevent, training fires that are started by training. We'd much rather start them on our own and control them than to have them start without any notice from a lot of our munitions. Once again, we'll be burning about 14,000 acres out of the 56,000 at Camp Ripley, so a large portion of camp does get burned every year. A portion of them are for preventative burns to keep training fires down, but the stuff in red you see on the map are what we call vegetation enhancement burns, where we're trying to manage what kind of vegetation's actually there, be it returning it to prairie or taking some of the brush out from underneath the trees. So, next slide. Our ACUB Sentinel Landscape program, I know a lot of you have heard about that in the past. We continue to dump some money into that. In FY17, we were able to leverage about $4 million worth of purchases of easements from willing landowners. In 2018, we got a match from the Sard Council, the Heritage Council, and about $3.1 million in 2018. And so with that, we've got about 26,000 enrolled acres, and we've got about 200 plus landowners that are still interested. And if you start to look at the maps, the red is land that's been enrolled, the pink is willing landowners that are waiting to get enrolled, and the green is land that is what we consider compatible use. It's already protected in some manner, and these easements, obviously, we've spent millions and millions of dollars on improving Camp Ripley, and so the easements are really an effort for us to ensure that I don't have encroachment and housing developments and things like that within a 3-mile buffer of camp. The city of Pillager is not entirely happy because we've effectively easement them out of any real serious growth inside of their community. So there are some negatives involved with that as well, especially for a community like Pillager that's up in the Brainerd-Baxter area and has a lot of chance for growth. So, next slide. And ladies, gentlemen, that would conclude my update, but I'd gladly take any questions that you have for me.
Mr. President, I don't have a question, but my token comment every year is thank you for the infusion into our local economy. We would be in dire straits without all the employment and all the money that is spent in our community. So thank you very much.
Well, I told the team that for these briefs, I wanted to start including a picture of somebody that lived in each community that we went to brief, with a quick highlight of that hero in your midst. Unfortunately, you know, I'd have to have about 300 pictures there, because you have a lot of my employees that work and live in your community, and we're proud to be part of Little Falls. So thank you.
Thank you.
I would like to comment too. I've had the chance to work with them in the environmental program and the Camp Ripley Veterans State Trail and disc golf, and they're really receptive to working with the public, so I really appreciate that.
Yeah. So, thank you, Frank. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next will be the consent agenda. 2018 Consumer Confidence Report for Water received. Animal Control Report March 2019 received. Application for exempt permit and temporary on-sale malt beverage license, Our Lady of Lourdes Church Bazaar, July 27th and 28th, 2019 approved. Application for exempt permit and temporary on-sale malt beverage license, Holy Family Church Heritage Days, June 6, 2019 approved. Building report, March 2019 receive. Dam Festival Medallion Hunt, Mid-Minnesota Federal Credit Union approve. Display of fireworks permit, Dean Schmidt Lions Park approve. Fire report, March 2019 receive. Heritage Preservation Commission minutes, April 2019 receive. Housing and Redevelopment Authority minutes, March 2019 receive. Investment recap dated March 31st, 2019 receive. Internship, Corey Steininger, St. Cloud Technical and Community College, ratify, confirm. National Register of Historic Places, additional documentation, Linden Hill receive. On-sale malt beverage license, Sanchez Brito approve. Police report, March 2019 receive. Public Works report, March 2019 receive. Recycling reports, January and February 2019 receive. Wastewater report, March 2019 receive. What is the wish of the council?
Mr. President, I make a motion that we approve, receive, and ratify the items from the consent agenda.
Second.
Motion by Councilmember Hanson, second by Councilmember Lundberg. Any discussion?
Yes, Mr. President. I'm looking at on page 17 in the water report, there was lead that was think I turned it on, no.
It's on.
There was lead determined to be in 2 out of the 20 houses that were inspected. My question is there anything, and I'm not sure if you have the answer to this or not, but are we doing any investigation and what's being done, and are we doing any other testing in the area where these 2 houses were shown to have lead levels within them places?
I don't know the answer to that. We can certainly find out and report that back to you.
Didn't it say somewhere in the report that usually that was caused by old plumbing in the house itself?
Well, it could be, or it could be done by a number of other things too. That's why I was wondering if there was any testing being done in any of the other residents. If these two residents were in the same location, was there any other testing that's being done to see if there's other contamination issues that's going on there? Chances are, yes, it's probably a pipe issue within the house.
I can tell you that the testing that we do is in several different locations. We typically don't test properties that are right next door to each other. They're typically in various locations, and we change those locations from time to time so that we get a good sampling. But again, we'll certainly check that out and get back to you.
We could probably have an answer right now if Dwayne was sitting here, right?
Yeah, exactly, exactly, yeah.
All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Public hearings and lettings. Lettings, leaf and brush collection, Bob Lemire roll-offs, refuse and recycling award. Lori.
Yes, we did go out and requested quotes for the annual spring leaf and brush collection. We received one quote from Bob Lemire Roll-Offs Refuse and Recycling in the amount of $4,050. Last spring, the bid that we received was $3,830, so it's about $200 more than last year's. The date for the pickup is Saturday, May 11th, rain or shine, and they will be leaving the bags. So when you put your bags out there, don't tie them. They can just dump the leaves out, leave a rock or something heavy to put on top of the bags once they empty them out. But that will be Saturday, May 11th, rain or shine. The money for the leaf and brush collection comes from the grant that we receive, the cleanup day grant that we receive from the county.
What's the wish of the council?
Move to approve.
Second.
Motion by Councilmember Knopfler, second by Councilmember Storley. Any discussion? All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Public hearing and lettings continued. Number 2, Resolution 2019-29, award general obligation permanent improvement revolving fund bonds, Series 2019A. Lori.
David Drown from David Drown Associates is here, and he has the results of the bids that went out today for our 2018 petition projects. So.
That's right. Evening, Council. A couple of weeks ago, you authorized us to take a $1.7 million bond issue to market to fund last year's petition projects. We sold those by a competitive sale process, and this morning we received 5 bids on the sale of those bonds. I think the tab may be in your packet, but I'll read the results. We did have 5 bidders. The low bidder was United Bankers Bank. They're a pretty normal bidder on your bond sales. They bid at a price that turns into a net effective rate of 2.64%. Second was Robert W. Baird, bidding 2.7%. Northland Securities, also a little over 2.7. Stifel at 2.79, and IFS Securities, which is a new name to me, 2.85. So fairly tight bids. A couple of weeks ago, we estimated that the interest rate on this debt would be a little over 3%. We're borrowing money closer to 2. Over time, that's 60 grand better in terms of payment savings. So the market has moved in our direction. That's a good result. As part of this process, we did go to Standard & Poor's and have the city's bond rating renewed. No real surprises in that process. You've been at an A-plus rating for a long time. You're still an A-plus rating. Rating report didn't reveal anything particularly remarkable, except to say that all of the things you practically can do to manage the city's financing were well done. You get high marks there. The incomes in this level of the state are not that high, and you get dinged for that. That's probably the main reason why your credit rating isn't any higher. And my staff made me promise to point out that as we write the official statements, the bond sale documents for these, we calculate some financing ratios. And the portion of the city's tax levy that needs to be devoted toward your debt payments has hit a 20-year low. So to the degree that's good news and you're driving property taxes down by constraining your debt payments, you're making good progress. You just hit a 20-year milestone. So no surprises and basically good information. These are good sale results. My recommendation to the City Council would be to move forward with the sale of bonds and pass a resolution that is provided to you, awarding the sale to United Bankers Bank, who bid a net effective rate of 2.6457%.
What's the wish of the council?
Motion to adopt Resolution 2019-29.
Is there a
I'll second.
Motion by Councilmember Storley, second by Councilmember Goshek. Any discussion? With the resolution, call a roll, please.
Knopfler?
Yes.
Lundberg?
Yes.
Zilka?
Yes.
Hurkak?
Yes.
Storley?
Yes.
Hanson?
Yes.
Gushik?
Yes.
Carries.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good to see you again.
Resolution 2019-34, award bid, wastewater treatment facility improvements, Rice Lake Construction Group of Deerwood. Adopt.
Council President, we have Colin Markison here from SEH. He can give us some more input on the results of the bid for the wastewater treatment facility.
Thanks again, Council and John. As I said during the work session, we had two bidders on the project. One was Rice Lake Construction Group at $18,782,300. The other bidder was Magni Construction. Their bid was just over $19 million at $19,012,000. So relatively close bids, which is good. Rice Lake also included costs for alternates, A and B. Alternate A, their bid price was $73,942. That's for installation of storm sewer inside the fence at the wastewater treatment facility site. Alternate B is a lump sum of $14,700. That is for salvage and delivery of retaining wall block on site to the city. Those prices for both of those alternates are fair in my opinion. Upon doing an investigation of the bid, I think both were good bids. Rice Lake Construction Group is more than capable of doing this work, and I would recommend that you award the contract to Rice Lake Construction Group with both alternate A and alternate B for a lump sum total of $18,870,942.
Motion to concur with and adopt the SEH group recommendation.
Before a second, I think we should have some wording in there, including alternate A and alternate B.
That is in the resolution.
It's in the resolution.
Oh,
Yeah.
well, second.
Motion by Councilmember Starley, second by Councilmember Hanson. Is there any discussion? Resolution, call the roll, please.
Lundberg.
Yes.
Zilka.
Yes.
Kirkhoff.
Yes.
Storley.
Yes.
Hanson.
Yes.
Gutschik.
Yes.
Knopfler.
Yes.
Carries.
Thank you. New business, staffing at wastewater facility, approve. John?
Thank you, Council President. In the past few weeks, we've had a position opening for the wastewater treatment facility as an operator. We conducted interviews and found multiple qualified candidates for that position. I'm actually coming to you tonight to request offering an additional position to one of those candidates. And so instead of hiring one, we'd be hiring two. With the bid that we just awarded for the construction project for the wastewater treatment plant, we're going to have significant need for operators in the facility. There's going to be a lot going on with this project. It is a significant renovation where they're going to be demoing things and rebuilding the plant in different functions. So there's a lot of staging that's going to be happening over the next couple of years. A lot of our systems that have computer operations, electronic monitoring systems might be offline for certain periods of times. We need the bodies there to be serving that plant. Effectively, over the past 5 months, we've had two operators operating the waste plant, and they are at capacity and very fearful for their operations and the work that they could do during this construction phase, and they're going to need support. So I really advocate that we be able to offer the position to an additional candidate tonight.
Mr. President, you have two people already that you're looking at for this, or?
We've conducted interviews. We took applications, had 13 applications for the position, conducted interviews, actually had 3 candidates that we had that met our satisfaction of the interview team that we would be willing to offer a position to. We ranked them, offered it to one candidate who declined. We have 2 candidates remaining that we would like to offer the position to. We have authorization to offer it to one. That's been extended, and I believe they will accept. We're just finalizing some details.
Mr. President, John, we had also discussed that we had planned to do this in 2020.
Yes, this would be part of a longer-term plan. It is just moving the position up earlier based on additional needs and concerns with this project as it stands as well. So we did not anticipate when we were looking through the budget year that we'd be in a position where we'd only have 2. Due to the resignation of one employee, we're effectively down to just 2 operators. So this is effectively backfilling part of that position as well.
Mr. President, I make a motion that we approve the authorization to hire the second individual.
Second.
Motion by Councilmember Hanson, second by Councilmember Lundberg. Any discussion?
Oh, just we have a packed house here. I'd just like to mention we're short a superintendent anyway, so there's little ramifications to the budget. And so actually we're getting our staffing more to where it needs to be.
Yes. In the long term, this is ideally where our staffing would be, and I'm confident that we can accommodate it within this year's budget.
All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Passes. Ordinance number 15, 7th series, sale of property, ABS Properties LLC. Introduce, Lori.
Yes, Council President. About 2 years ago, the Economic Development Authority and the city worked with ABS Supply, did a TIF project with them for the building a new facility in the Chief Hole in the Day Industrial Park. Since that time, they've opened their business and have purchased a new business or a new complementary to what they're currently doing, which is sandblasting materials. And they would like to build another facility right adjacent to the current facility that they have. So the council had a public hearing. We did agree to expand that TIF district. So now the next part of that would be to sell them the lot. So this is the lot adjacent to what they currently own to the west. They will be constructing a new warehouse facility on that lot.
For introduce, we just need a motion and a second?
Correct, just a motion to introduce.
I'll make a motion to introduce.
Second.
Resolution 2019-33, authorize submittal of grant Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development, Contamination Investigation and Response Action Plan, and Agreement for Grant Application Assistance, Landmark Environmental LLC. Approve and adopt. Lori.
So, Council President and council members, we probably last fall worked with Landmark Environmental to look at potential contaminants on the site located between 2nd and 5th Avenues Northeast and 5th and 6th Street. They did a preliminary investigation on that property. So now the next step would be to apply for a grant to deed to do a contamination investigation on the property. The grant is a matching grant, if I remember correctly, John, right? Yeah, it's a matching grant. So Landmark would apply for and administer that grant for us. We've done work with them in the past and have been very, very happy with the results working with them to do the grant applications and do the investigation work.
What's the wish of the council?
Mr. President, I move to adopt and approve Resolution 2019-33 to authorize the submittal of a grant.
Second.
Motion by Councilmember Lundberg, second by Councilmember Storley. Any discussion?
Yes, Mr. President. I just have a question on how is the arrangement working here? The bulk of this land is owned, according to Beacon, by Uppsala Co-op Creamery. Mm-hmm. Wouldn't it be their responsibility to test that land and handle any remediation of contaminants?
The grant submittal has to be by a government entity. Yep. So we are working with them to do the investigative portion
working with
this.
the current owner?
Yes.
Okay, and
yes.
that was a question. I
yes.
didn't see that listed anywhere.
Yeah, we're working with them to do this
So
investigation.
I'm making the assumption they're looking at tearing most, if not of all of those buildings down and selling it to a developer of some sort at some time.
Yeah.
Yes. With these programs, Council President, deed MPCA remediation for contaminated sites. There's a lot of programs that need a city to facilitate financing the money for that.
Fiscal agent, basically.
The fiscal agent for. So we have met with the owners of that property, the operators there. They have no intention of utilizing the property afterwards and understand its environmental implications. So we're going through the process in the best way we can to ensure access to funds that can help support cleanup for this site.
Landmark is who we worked with for the Clark Station also?
Yes, we did some work with them on the Clark Station. They also worked on the Hennepin Paper site with us. Yes.
Resolution, call a roll, please.
Zilka?
Yes.
Kirkhock?
Yes.
Storley?
Yes.
Hanson?
Yes.
Gushik?
Yes.
Knopfler?
Yes.
Lundberg?
Yes.
Carries.
City Council reports on city authorities, boards, bureaus, commissions, or committees. Does anyone have anything? Any announcements? Our next item, we're going to be an open meeting, not closed, correct? Correct. So it will be an open meeting pursuant to Minnesota Statute 13D.05, Subdivision 2B, regarding preliminary consideration of charges against a City of Little Falls employee. The employee is Greg Kimmen. Under Minnesota statutes, section 13D.05, subdivision 2, Greg Kimmen requested that this portion of the meeting be open. Mr. Kimmen, I'm going to ask you to please review, sign, and date this meeting advisory while we proceed with the meeting.
And Mr. President, Mr. Kimmen has signed it, so that has been done.
We are considering City Administrator John Rademacher's letters to Greg Kimmen of April 10th and 11th, 2019, through which he is recommending that Greg Kimmen be dismissed from employment with the city. Council members, I recommend that we do the following. Give Mr. Rademacher time to give us background on the charges against Mr. Kimmen. Give Mr. Kimmen and his representative an opportunity to respond to the recommendation. After he has made his presentation, the City Council will deliberate on potential action to take. If we're going to take any formal action on the recommendation tonight, we would do that through a motion and a vote. City Council members, do you have any comments on the proposed process?
Mr. President, will we have a chance to ask questions and stuff too through this process, or are we just here to absorb what's being said?
I believe we get to the right spot. There's a spot for us to ask questions as well.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Rademacher, please provide us some background on the charges.
Thank you, Council President. In early January of this year, I was meeting with a former employee of the city, and in that conversation, he had mentioned that it came up in their conversation with Mr. Kimmen and this individual that he asked Greg about stock ownership that he had with SEH. And in that meeting, Greg did not at that point deny that, and he expressed this to me. Following that, I made an inquiry to a representative at SEH as to whether or not they were an employee-owned company. I was not aware of Mr. Kimmen's stock ownership, so I wanted to check in, and I did leave a message. They followed up with me later the following week, said indeed that it is an employee-owned company. Greg was a shareholder, that because of their company policy, him being a shareholder, he was not eligible to divest his stock interests for at least 5 years after his employment with the city, or with SEH, and that they, in 2015, were concerned, had some concerns about this potentially coming up as an issue, and made some acknowledgments to Greg in terms of options that they would provide for him to maybe address this as a potential conflict of interest. They recommended that he could move his share value into a cash or money market account. Their finance officer felt that might suffice the conflict of interest issue, but it was ultimately up to Greg's decision to make a determination of what to do about that, his interest. Following that call, I contacted Brandon Fitzsimmons with Flaherty and Hood, our labor attorney, and asked about what I had learned, whether or not Greg's ownership interests had potential conflicts with the city, and he indicated to me that it certainly did, that there's potential even for some state law that could bring up some conflict, but we should certainly move forward and investigate this more fully and make a determination of whether or not any conflict of interest violations occurred. This was around January 15th. We contacted Michelle Soldo, investigator, to help be a third party and research this matter for us. After that, Michelle was given information from the city, meeting minutes, contracts, public information that we had in our engagements with the City of Little Falls and SEH from 2012 to 2019. and she began a research onto that data. Following Michelle's research into that, she also looked into both state statute and the association that governs professional engineers in the state of Minnesota, identified their conflict of interest or their code of ethics, and concluded that based on the information that was given to her, the potential that Greg is a stock owner with SEH, that there was a clear violation of the standards of their code of conduct as a professional engineer with the and Greg's potential for stock ownership with SEH and that code. It isn't a matter of a gray area of how much or what sort of level of financial interest. If there's any financial interest, they have a duty to disclose. Over Michelle's findings, she found that there were multiple instances where Greg had an impact into a decision to work with SEH, that he was one of the key proponents of doing the work with them. He drafted, signed memos, advocated for utilizing SEH to the council, approving bids. The process did not include any other additional engineering firms. There wasn't he did not seek input from other firms for that work. It was strictly working with only SEH. Now that they are providing a professional service, so there isn't a duty to for us to do competitive bidding on that. So that wasn't something that sparked me as a question at the time. I was not aware of Greg's ownership interest, so I had no reason to question that. Prior to my arrival, we had engaged in some dealings with SEH and doing some feasibility work with our water plant and wastewater treatment plants. And then, so it made sense to me I had made an assumption that Greg would have disclosed this or moved past that conflict. However, he had not. I think in terms of Michelle's findings, it's clear what you saw in the letters that I provided. However, post the original report finding, I was conducting a search into, and after we moved forward based on input with Brandon of how we should proceed in addressing placing Greg on administrative leave, I looked into, contacted our IT to get access to emails that he had, just to ensure that we were also following up with work and duties that Greg had started, making sure that we were contacting people or making sure things were getting done and addressed. In that search, I did come across correspondence that Greg had with employees of SEH during his time in the city. This was between 2017 and 2018. In those emails, Greg and the employees at SEH talked about their 401k earnings and the things that they were doing. It seemed although it was like a contest to see who could have the best earnings during a certain period of time, and they made comments to Greg that he was the 401k master, or that even one went so far as to, why are you, in a seemingly, to me, jokingly fashion, but why are you a city engineer? You seem to be pretty good at this 401k performance. Based on those findings, as well as the conflict of interest that were clear violations of his professional conduct, it's evident that I believe Greg was fully aware of his stock ownership and that being a conflict of interest, and failing to do anything to disclose that or follow the process to acknowledge it and keep himself segregated from the decision-making process, that he's failed in his professional standards, ethics, and he's certainly placed the city at risk in our workings and dealings with SEH.
Mr. Kim, and you and your representative may now make your presentation.
Most of you know me. To give you kind of my history, I was born and raised in Little Falls. You know, after graduating from high school year, I went to school in North Dakota to get a job. After graduating in Fargo, I got a job there 2 years while my wife finished college. While I was still working in North Dakota, I bought a house here in Little Falls before she graduated because we knew Little Falls was going to be our home. This is where we wanted to be. This is where we wanted to put down our roots. You know, after my wife graduated, we moved back to Little Falls. I moved back here even before I had a job. It was a leap of faith because this is where we wanted to be. This is where we wanted to grow our family. Fortunately, I was able to get a job with SEH. I stayed there for 12 years. They were fortunate enough to give me a job. Part of their retirement plan is company stock. I've always made it open that about my employment with SEH. It's knowledge right on their website that they are an employee-owned company. When I left, I did receive that letter indicating that I can't sell those shares within 5 years. I first learned about this cash account that Mr. Rademacher is talking about from the letter from that supplemental letter that Mr. Rademacher sent over to me. The information in that email that you see was never forwarded to me. For whatever reason, it wasn't. So the first time I learned about that cash account option was about a week ago. You know, throughout my career, this is the job that I've always wanted. I've always wanted to be the city engineer for the town that I lived in. And in 2014, I was given that opportunity to fulfill my dream. I'm not going to intentionally throw away my dream over something stupid as this. You know, the allegations against me tonight really are not in line with my character. I've asked all these people to be here in support of me, not even able to tell them what this is about. They know my character, they know who I am, they know what I stand for, and they showed up for me. So thank you, everyone, for doing that. And I hope the council sees that as well, because all I can ask for is your forgiveness and a chance to at my job again. None of this was intentional. I've always had the best interest of Little Falls in mind with all of my recommendations, and so that, I hope you give me a chance.
City council members, you may now respond or ask questions of Mr. Kimmin and or his representative, which they can reply to. Oh, I'm sorry.
Good evening, Mr. President. Kevin Beck. I'm an attorney with the law firm of Kelly & Lemons. I'll try to keep this brief. I know it's the last item on a late night agenda, but I wanted to kind of respond to Mr. Rademacher's report and also address some other issues. First off, jumping to discharge of a 5-year employee with a good work record is excessive. There are other measures that can be taken to alleviate this issue. And you heard from Greg. At most, it was a mistake that he didn't disclose this. He didn't think about it. He got a letter, and I can show you examples of the letters that they get, where it's a letter from SDH saying you don't work here anymore, you have more than $5,000 worth of ESOP shares, and you can't do anything with those for a period of 5 years until you turn age 55, are disabled, or you die. That's it. He gets a statement once a year that says, here's your ownership plan, or here's your ownership share amount, and he files it and forgets about it. He's always disclosed that he worked for SDH. The city's practice is to directly negotiate professional services contract, which is in line with state law. However, a simple practice of putting out RFPs for professional services contracts would alleviate some of these issues. There's no allegation that SEH was unqualified to do any of the work or unable to do any of the work, and a lot of the projects had specific reasons why SEH was approached. The water treatment plant, the engineer at SEH had designed the original water treatment plant, so it made sense to go back to her. The wastewater treatment plant, my understanding is that there were issues with the previous engineers. SEH has particular expertise and experience in wastewater management and wastewater plants, and that is why Mr. Kimmin approached them. The bridge project that's listed, SEH had performed a nearly identical project in Sauk Rapids several years prior. That is why they were approached. There's no allegation in any of the letters. The statute that was referenced or obliquely referred to by the city administrator does not appear in the letters because it applies to public officers. The League of Minnesota Cities has opined that that is you, that is elected officials. The League of Minnesota Cities says we don't know if it applies to city employees. There's no city policy on point that talks about a conflict of interest. Rather, it's a generalized perception, code of conduct type of policy that's cited in the letters from Mr. Rademacher. All of the stuff, for lack of a better term, that is cited are PE canons, professional engineer canons. But the Professional Engineering Board has taken no action against Mr. Kimmin. And quite frankly, it's outside of Mr. Rademacher's purview and jurisdiction to interpret, and Ms. Soldo's for that matter, to make interpretations and opinions on professional engineering rules. That's not her job. Her job is to investigate and present facts. I want to address, Mr. Rademacher talked about this email about a competition between 401k and stocks. The ESOP plan, the employee stock ownership plan, is completely separate from the 401k. It has nothing to do with the 401k and Mr. Kimmin's performance or returns on his 401k. Those are publicly traded, typically publicly traded stocks, mutual funds, large stuff where anybody who's got a 401k, you can probably go in and figure out how you want to allocate your percentages. Completely separate from the ESOP plan. The stocks that are referenced in those emails are personal, publicly traded stocks, not ESOP stocks. The email that talks about the cash account, Mr. Kimmin said the first time he heard about it was a week ago. If you look at the actual email string, there's no evidence that it was actually sent to Mr. Kimmin. There's no evidence that Mr. Kimmin was actually copied on those emails. They're internal emails between two SEH employees. One other thing that I think is important to bring up that has not been talked about yet tonight is Mr. Kimmin's involvement in a unionization effort of management level employees at the City of Little Falls. On March 20th, he filed a petition with the Minnesota Bureau of Mediation Services with his name on it as the representative to organize a group of employees. That same day, a status quo order was issued. 2 days later, he's called in to do his investigation with Ms. Soldo. 2 business days after that, he's placed on administrative leave. To discharge this employee certainly smacks of anti-union animus, of retaliating against an employee for engaging in concerted activities, discriminating in regard to tenure because of his actions related to union activities. There are 4 separate unfair labor practices that I see if this council discharges this employee. You have options. The 5-year timeline is quickly approaching. Mr. Kimmin's 5-year separation from SEH is mid-May, less than a month away, just a few weeks away, at which point he will be able to fully divest these shares. He could be continued on leave until that time. He could, now that he's aware of the cash option, he can work with SEH to get that money transferred over there to address some of these issues. And both parties can move forward. You have a highly trained, highly valuable, professional employee. Then you have an opportunity to correct any deficiencies. You have an opportunity to correct your own internal policies to prevent certain circumstances like this from arising in the future. But you shouldn't discharge somebody for this. There's ruined somebody's life because of a mistake, an honest mistake that hasn't harmed the city. There's no actual evidence. All the talk from the city administrator is speculative. This could harm. This could impact. There's no evidence that it has. Thank you.
City council members, you may now respond or ask questions of Mr. Kimmin.
Mr. President?
Go ahead.
I was looking through all of these emails between Mr. Kimmin and his former fellow employees at SEH. And the stocks that were mentioned were PLM, ENTG, Contrafund, KW Investments, Polymit, Veiled, MRO, ENTG, Ford, Broadcom, QCOM, NXPI, JPM, and Amazon, and not once was an SEH stock mentioned. And every single one of the stocks that was mentioned is a publicly traded stock that any one of us could buy and rearrange within our own personal 401ks. So I don't see any evidence of him even talking about an SEH stock. So I don't really see how these emails are incriminating. Terry Witzka's 41019 email to John references Greg's ESOP stocks, which are SEH stocks, and those stocks would only be wait, sorry, let me move on. The emails between Terry and James in 2015 talk about rolling his ESOP shares into 401ks, but nowhere do we have the answer to what Greg actually did with those ESOP shares. Now we find out that he didn't even know that that was an option. Again, Mrs. Solder reports that Mr. Kimmin has SEH stock, and now we hear from him that he actually does, but nowhere in the report did it show us that he had these stocks. And then the last point that I'd like to make, Mr. President, is that in the letter Mr. Rademacher wrote to him, the policy 16 that's stated there, the discipline stating, is that city employees shall be subject to disciplinary action for failing to fulfill their duties and responsibilities, including observance of all work rules. And this talks about a disciplinary action, not termination of employment. So I think that we should really be looking at some options for a disciplinary action rather than a termination of employment. It just seems completely unwarranted to me.
Our next step is deliberation.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. Our next step is deliberation. Right now is for questions if we have any of them.
Well, I jumped the gun. I have no questions.
I have some comments. I don't know if it's questions, but as far as Greg's integrity, I've always respected him. I remember a time where he opposed SEH concerning settling ponds and putting in the mechanical waste treatment plant. So if he was looking at monetary gain at that point, it was a poor way of showing it because he opposed and wanted a settling pond. In the past, before Greg was here, I've been on the council quite a while. We've worked with SEH on a lot of programs, and they've always been a really good company, and that's why we've went with them. They've always did well by us. So even, lately we do a lot with SEH. It's still, Greg can make a suggestion, but it's still up to us which way we went on these, and it was the ultimate vote was ours, And I don't feel like I was totally influenced to vote in any direction by Greg. And the only concern I would have is if through this we're open to some form of litigation, then I'd have to look at it a different way. But I'm kind of standing with what I just heard from Mikkel, maybe a discipline versus something else, but anyway.
I have a question for you, Greg. When you're looking at your year-to-date returns, and do you exclude your SEH stock when you were looking at that? It didn't cross your mind that that was there?
The only time that I see the SEH stuff is once a year. Their fiscal year ends June 31st, and so once a year I get a piece of paper that says, this is what your SEH stock is. And to be honest, I open it up, I look at it, and I put it in the receipt bin. I spend maybe 5 minutes a year looking at it, and that's about it. The 401k stuff in my year-to-date, that's a completely separate account. Those are strictly the publicly traded companies, and that's what the year-to-date amount is based off of.
Thank you.
Mr. President, go ahead.
Okay, my question is, I want some clarification. I don't necessarily care who it comes from, but I'd like to hear the details again on the intent to organize and that timeline.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Just to go back a little further, and Greg can correct me if I'm incorrect. This unit used to be represented by MAPE, the Minnesota Association of Professional Employees. MAPE disclaimed
I can't hear you.
Is that better?
No.
MAPE disclaimed, I'll just talk about it. MAPE disclaimed their interest in February of 2019, which is effectively the union saying we don't want to represent this unit anymore. Greg and I think there's 5 other employees who were in that unit discussed what to do. They reached out to 2 unions to take over representation, and then ultimately decided on doing an independent association. And so on March 20th, a petition was signed by Greg that indicated a desire to unionize this bargaining unit into an association of employees. In Minnesota, Pelra, your city attorney can correct me if I'm wrong on this, you don't necessarily have to be a union, you just have to be an association of employees, an employee association, which is loosely defined as a group of employees with
Would it be fair to say it's just correct organic, right? Not being represented by a formal collective bargaining unit, but just the former MAPE level employees within the city getting together to, well, effectively collectively bargain amongst themselves.
Correct.
Is that accurate?
Yes. Yes, and so that was filed, my understanding, March 20th. Status quo order was issued the same day, which is effectively an order saying, don't change anything, don't change working conditions until an election can be had. I don't believe an election has been had yet.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. President, can I jump in? Councilmember Hanson asked a little more concretely on the timeline on that. Quickly, the investigation by the city against Mr. Kimmin started in January of 2019. March 19th of 2019, City Administrator Rademacher formally gave notice to Mr. Kimmin of the 3 charges against him and in order to appear. Then the next day, Mr. Kimmin filed a petition with the Bureau of Mediation Services to unionize, again, after the investigation commenced and the day after Mr. Rademacher had informed him of the charges against him.
Okay.
Do you have some questions?
Yes, Mr. President. So I've heard that Little Falls has done business with SEH before Greg Kimmin was hired as an engineer, correct? So he hasn't pulled them in, and it sounds like his SEH options, he had a 5-year hold on that. What would have been the penalty if you would have tried, or could you not even sell off that stock before that?
Councilmember Stoyle, I have a letter. It's not the one to Mr. Kimmin, but he can say it's identical to the one he received. That kind of explains it. If I can pass it out, I'll just hand it to the city administrator.
And I'll just keep going. Now, you're not being charged by the professional engineers group at all and possibly losing your engineering license to disqualify you from continuing your employment with the city of Little Falls?
Correct. I have not been contacted by the Professional Engineers Association.
So they haven't formally done anything as far as doing anything to pull your licensure or your certificate or anything? As far as his records go, is there any disciplinary action in Mr. Kimmon's record as of up to this point?
Council President,
Please.
I issued an oral reprimand to Mr. Kimmon after the memo regarding his regret for ever recommending SEH for our wastewater treatment project. And I thought the statement of that letter was unprofessional, both for him and Mr. Bundy, who was on at the time. Oral reprimand was issued to both of them. Consideration for a written reprimand was made, but ultimately withdrawn.
So that's the only disciplinary action that has been that Mr. Kimmon has been confronted with at all since his employment with the city of Little Falls?
That's the only formal process that I would comment to.
Your shares in the SEH from the time you left till the time you became, or up till now, do you know what that is? I mean, to me, it sounds like you made most of your stock earnings with SEH during the time you were employed with them. What have you gained from the time you're as a Little Falls employee up until now?
So from the time from SEH to now, I did not receive any additional gain or any additional shares from the company. Once you leave employment, basically those are the shares that you are stuck with. So there's no additional shares from the company after that point.
And in your 401k, are you investing money that from your wages right now through the city of Little Falls into that 401k program?
No.
Mr. President, the thing is, I've personally been involved with arbitrations before, and they can cost thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars to arbitrate a case like this. If you know, I guess we'll have to talk about that later. I think that's all I have for right now.
Any other question? Anyone else have any questions?
Just one more question before we get to the deliberation from me anyway, and that's when we started this, and I'm always looking for what's the genesis, what initiated the action, and John, you mentioned that this came to light from a former employee that brought this up in conversation to you?
Yes.
Okay, and you know, I obviously don't want to violate any whistleblower rules or anything like that. Are we at liberty to share who that individual was? And if not, maybe the results of why they're a former employee? I'm just looking, you know, I want to rule out an axe to grind here from the word go.
Yeah, and Councilmember Hanson, if I'm going to chime in, that would be private personnel data on the other individual. So generally, you can only talk about why individual employees leave if they left as a result of discharge, and that's not happened in this case. So we cannot divulge the name or the reasons for separation of the former employee.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. President, was that former employee an employee of the city of Little Falls or an employee of SEH?
It was an employee of the city of Little Falls.
Mr. President, if I could, did I hear that during this 5 years, Greg, that you received 5 letters from SEH regarding your stocks or your ESOP?
No, I would have received 4.
Okay.
One when I left, one at year 1, year 2, and then year 3. I haven't received the year 5 one.
Okay, and then I don't know who could answer this, but as we talked about, if that engineer group, whatever it was called, has issued any kind of disciplinary, are they aware of this since this was all somewhat kept private? You know, I don't know how they could discipline if they don't know about it. So I don't know if that's would they know about it without having some insider information that there was a violation? Anybody?
I don't know.
So, yeah, Mr. Mayor, the board organically doesn't look for engineers engaging in potential misconduct. Somebody affirmatively has to make a complaint. Now, we are not aware of any complaint, but again, much like the city of Little Falls, they're subject to some data privacy laws. So whether or not there's a pending complaint, or we would know if there's a final disposition that would result in the loss of a licensure of a PE, but we don't have any knowledge whether or not there's been a complaint filed or if there's any pending proceeding with the board.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. President, so what you're saying is the city of Little Falls didn't file a code of conduct violation with the engineering, professional engineer group related to this incident?
So, Councilmember Storley, two things related to that. On one hand, the affirmative obligation to report allegations of PE misconduct have to come from other PEs. So obviously, we only have one in the city. And two is, when you say that whether or not the city, filed the complaint, obviously you in the end game have authority over issues like that as a city council. So obviously, this is our first deliberation on that. So no, the city of Little Falls has not filed any type of complaint against Mr. Kimmin. That's going to be all up to you. Right now, though, however, we're focused on his employment with the city of Little Falls. So if that's an avenue you want to explore, we can do that. But I think you should first focus on his employment with the city of Little Falls before we got to that level, what to do, if anything, with the board.
Mr. President, I think that's something we need to know if that's going to happen, because if we do something to retain him, and then they go through a process of filing a complaint, and then they come through and revoke his certificate or his engineering license, where do we go then,
Yeah, and Councilmember Storley, related to that, if you look at Mr. Rademacher's recommendation to dismiss letter of April 10th, that is one of his grounds. He's asserting that it's Mr. Rademacher's opinion based on the Minnesota administrative rules, based on the Minnesota statute, and based on the engineering code of ethics, that his conduct has jeopardized his PE license. So, I just want to be technical. From the employment perspective, it's not just has something happen, is it reasonably likely, or could it happen? And again, that's one of the grounds for Mr. Rademacher. He is concerned based on this conduct and it being a conflict of interest under the Minnesota administrative rules that he could lose his PE license, and to clarify, as part of the job description that is required, and not only would an individual lose potentially their PE license, they also could not perform PE services for the city. So that is one of the grounds. The word, again, the key word in all that, the city administrator Rademacher felt his conduct applied to the rules jeopardized his ability to maintain his license.
Mr. President, I've heard the term city at risk, that the city is potentially put at risk because of these actions. Could you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, so tough to define risk, but one risk, albeit it was not a grounds in City Administrator Rademacher's discharge as a reason, because it's primarily a criminal basis, which that's not something we're going to find or conclude, is that I'm going to not apply directly to Mr. Kimmin, but there is a specific statute that Mr. Beck did reference, Minnesota Statute 471, I believe it's .895, that says something to the effect either public officer or official, if they have a direct financial interest in a contract that they are involved with, that one, it could be a gross misdemeanor, and then two, the exposure to the city, if that were the case, it would deem any contracts with that entity as null and void. But I want to clarify, that's an issue that was not cited as a grounds in Mr. Rademacher's letter. That was more for your information. There's a state statute that applies to direct personal financial interests.
Thank you.
Greg, I have a question for you, and I'd like to read from an email from someone from SEH. Doesn't say that it was to you. James, Greg left us a while back and is now the city engineer for the city of Little Falls. Greg has been sending some work our way, and we are concerned that there may be a perceived conflict of interest with him still holding an ESOP balance. Can this be rolled over to his 401k directly? Greg says he would be okay with that, which that indicates to me that they talked to you about it.
So in regards to that, the SEH stock, I don't like holding onto it because it's stuck for 5 years. There's nothing you can do with it. As you can see in the emails, in my 401k, I move stocks around. That's how I do better performance-wise. We never talked about a conflict of interest. And yes, I'd be okay with moving it over to my 401k, but I didn't know, number one, that I had the option to put it into a cash account. If I would have, that's probably the option that I would have went, because, like I said, I don't like the stock to be stagnant, if you will. I like to be able to move them around. And for whatever reason, that correspondence never made its way to me.
Thank you.
Mr. President, according to the list of projects we have that Mr. Kemen recommended SEH perform, the first project that he was involved with was on 8/23/15, and that email between Terry and James was 13 days earlier than that. So that doesn't make sense that he was sending business their way and there was a perceived conflict of interest. Unless he was just investigating the potential of that with, them, but he didn't bring it to the council until the 23rd, which was, that email was on the 10th.
Mr. President, can I chime in quickly on the facts of that?
Please.
Just to clarify, August 23rd, 2015 was the date the council ultimately approved that $56,000 project.
Right.
However, the work to get that work from SEH through Mr. Kemen occurred before that. So we don't have the exact date, for example, that Mr. Kemen started working on it, but it's obviously plausible he was working on making the arrangements to get the work and making the recommendation to council around that time of that August 10th email from SEH.
Any other questions?
It just kind of seems to me that the stock, or the shares that he has with a SEH company, all right, I think that's what we're concerned about most of all. So am I clear on saying that if SEH does a booming business, then the shares that he have increase in value, or not?
And Mr. President, would you like me to respond?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So though we don't have the finite numbers, Mr. Kemen did concede in his interview with Ms. Soldo, and it's clear that I want to clarify a couple of facts here. One, Mr. Kemen owned 1,700 shares directly of SEH stock. And the value of those stock, it was a little misleading Mr. Kemen to say he didn't get additional stock. We're not contesting that. What was left out of his response is that his stock was dependent on the financial outcome of SEH. So therefore, the more revenues and or profit that SEH brought in, the higher the value his 1,700 shares of stock would be. And that was the case even when he left employment with SEH, that the value of his stock would go up the greater the financial outcome of SEH was.
Mr. President, could I respond to Mr. Knafla's question in a little more detail?
Yes, Kevin.
Thank you. Just a point of comparison, the 6 contracts that are at issue here are about $1.5 million over the course of approximately 3 years. SEH is a very large engineering firm. Their central region, which includes Minnesota, so not the entire company, but just their central region, is approximately $200 million a year in revenue. So funneling, if the idea is that that Mr. Kemen conspired to funnel money into SEH to improve his stock, $1.5 million over the, let's say $500,000 over the course of annually is not going to be a huge, significant increase in the value of his shares. So Mr. Kimmel was correct. He did not get additional shares. Mr. Fitzsimmons is correct in that the value did go up. I guess the question for you is, did SEH's share value go up solely because the City of Little Falls awarded 6 contracts to them over a 3-year period?
And, Mr. President, may I jump in?
Yes, please.
Just to clarify, SEH is a reputable company, large revenue. We understand that. However, for a point of comparison, in the 3 years before Mr. Kimmin became employed with the city, between 11 and 14, the city had paid SEH about $93,000. From 2015 to 2017, while Mr. Kimmin was employed with the city of Little Falls paid SEH about $1.5 million. So again, I think what is important for the council is not just generally are they a big reputable company. Yes. However, if you look at the impact of the work, now what is plausible, maybe they would have obtained or all $1.5 million of those work, even if Mr. Kimmin weren't employed. However, I do want to clarify, if you look at, again, the state statute, Minnesota administrative rules, the engineer code of ethics, is not just did an individual gain, from personal interest, is it the appearance of, or as even the Professional Engineering Society Ethics Review Board had opined an opinion, subconsciously these rules exist that it's black and white. You must disclose and you must not participate, whether or not you intended or whether or not you achieve gain. If you have stock in a company that is awarded $1.5 million of projects, that's either definitely the appearance of a conflict of interest and may have directly financially benefited him, even if he states that was not the motive. That is why these rules in the public sector, even unlike the private sector, are more black and white. Again, the bottom line, if you've got stock, you need to disclose. If you've got stock in a company you're trying to get work for, you can't participate. It's pretty black and white in the public sector, and the rules and the statute we cited in the letter support that.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. So you're saying everybody in the public sector, such as us up here on the bench, on this council, if I have a savings account in a bank and they come forward with something that the city wants to do and that's approved and I approve of it, can I be held liable for that?
Yes, you can. Under one, there's the statute as a public officer rule that you must disclose. Now, we first have to start with there's disclosure, which again, if you look at City Administrator Rademacher's letter, that's the primary impetus. It's not could he have or did he benefit. It's the bottom line, you've got to disclose if you've got some financial interest. And again, your set of laws as public officials, elected officials, are different than the administrative rules and statutes that we're talking about in the engineering world. So again, you're a little different. And two is, once you disclose, two, then there's certain mechanisms in place with you as elected officials, which I'm not an expert on for elected officials. I practice labor employment law, but again, different bodies of law. So here we didn't have the disclosure, especially when you had 1,700 shares.
But if he's not a voting member of awarding that bid, does that play into the issue at all?
Yeah, so to be technical, if you look at Minnesota administrative rules, the state statute, and the engineering code of ethics, if there's anything that would appear to be a conflict of interest, it's not just, one, you must disclose, and two, once you disclose, then you can come up with the mechanisms to the extent you should or should not be involved. So the fundamental issue here is we had 8 different instances when he could have disclosed and he didn't, so we couldn't take those measures to not have him as actively engaged or have some checks and balances in place. Mr. Kimmon never gave the City of Little Falls that opportunity to make sure those were in place.
But he only made recommendations. He wasn't a voting member of the board of the council to approve those bids.
Yeah, that's correct. But by analogy, if you look at, for example, the elected official statute 471, I believe it's .895, if you can't participate and as a general proposition, anything which you might have a financial gain. So it's not just, are you a final decision maker? You should just not be participating and even recommending to the city council that that specific firm you have a financial interest in get that work. Or at least put in some checks and balances or other things to make sure it's not done for personal interest.
But his position is not an elected position, though.
That's correct. So again, you look at the Engineering Code of Ethics, their state statute, it's a perceived conflict of interest when an engineer, a PE, professional engineer, makes a recommendation to have their employer bring in work from a company they have a direct financial interest in. Their statute is not just can you, or their code of ethics is not just can you make the final decision. It's bottom line, you have to disclose, and after you disclose, we can decide if there are mechanisms to take place to make sure that we're not getting slanted information. And another example here, albeit, yes, there was some practice, but again, we had, of the 6 projects, Mr. Kimmin was involved in recommending SEH. There was no competitive process to get those 6 projects. So we had 1,700 chairs, yet it was just SEH. That was the final one that was recommended to the council.
What about the projects before he was hired here? Was there a competitive process involved with those?
Yeah, I'd have to, I don't recall. We do have the record on that. I just don't recall.
I could state some of them were working with Mr. Lochner. A lot of times he made a decision on them, and we went with the firm that would work out the best. The 3 sorry, Mr. President. The 3 prior years, you know, we'd have to know how many projects we actually did. There was a long time because of local government aid and stuff where we weren't doing projects. It took us a while to clean up some of the debt in the city, try to get through some hard times. And we've just been surfacing or coming out of where we paid off some old debts. We got some more LGA, so we are doing more projects. And concerning Mr. Kinman, he's been more progressive, attacking projects, trying to get things done, like taking care of the streets before they're destroyed, you know, seal coating and things like that. So I can understand that. I understand what the attorney was talking about there. There's a code of ethics, you know, as far as engineers and stuff, and it almost seems to me that's something we should leave in their hands and see what kind of result we get back from them. I'd like to see that. And the last thing is he was reprimanded for suggesting SEH shouldn't. He made a mistake and shouldn't have went with them. And that was the whole fiasco thing with the settling ponds and everything. And that was worth probably over $1.5 million. So he completely went against it. If he intently was trying to make some money, at that point, he went about it just backwards because he recommended that we do not go with SEH. We do not go with the mechanical pond. We go with the holding ponds or the settling ponds, and like Mr. Rademacher said, he was reprimanded verbally for it. Yes.
Council President, can I?
Go ahead, John.
The reprimand wasn't about not recommending SEH. The reprimand was about the language in the memo and putting in there something that was completely unprofessional and stating that he totally regretted ever working with SEH. I found that to be detrimental to the city and our either continued work with SEH or work with other engineering firms in the future. That was the reason for the reprimand and addressing that issue. It wasn't for him expressing his opinion. I indicated to him that it could have been done in a different way, a better way that wasn't unprofessional and putting the city in detriment with engaging in work with other engineering firms.
I'm sorry if I made it sound
I wanted to be very
toward
clear
you,
about that.
because that wasn't my intent. My intent was saying that he regretted working with SEH. He said it in an inappropriate way, and I can understand that also. But if he was out to make money off his stocks at that point, he sure went about it the wrong way. That's all I'm saying.
Mr. President, since all of the emails regarding the stock and the 408 program have nothing to do with SEH stock. Why were we given all of that information? To me, that it just feels like we're being sent, like we're being sent off on in a different direction, and it seems like it's really misleading. And it has absolutely, none of those emails had anything to do with SEH stock. It was all about the 401k.
I don't know, we found that out by asking him, but by
Right.
reading the emails, to me, that indicated he pays a lot of attention to his whole portfolio, and he'd know everything that was in it. I
And
didn't realize they were separate until I asked him. By asking him, I found that out.
And are we in the debate part now, or are we
You know, we're still on questions,
like we're
but
doing a lot of debating for not, for,
my question was, why did we get those emails? They have nothing to do with anything.
and I would.
Council President, can I address that? I tried to make comment to it. It wasn't, I agree in reading the emails that I didn't interpret them to be his performance of SEH, his stock ownership in SEH. Mine was his knowledge of stock in general, and that he would be very clear in understanding that doing work, adding work to a company would be financially beneficial to stock that he owned in that company. It wasn't a discovery that I said that I acknowledged that these were talking directly about his SEH stock performance. It was merely about his knowledge of how they operated, and that if given the chance to say that he didn't know that his work, advocating for work with SEH would benefit his stock shares, that would fall in conflict with this.
Craig and Kevin, thank you for your time today. Council members, we must now deliberate over the charges against Mr. Kimmin. I recommend that we discuss the recommendation that we received to dismiss Mr. Kimmin. If we're going to take any formal action on the recommendation tonight, we would do that through a motion and a vote. Let's proceed with our deliberation.
Mr. President, I'd just like to make a couple comments. To me, this was avoidable. I don't like being up here. I don't like being on this spot. This is what we're here for. It's not fun. Greg worked for me at Coburn's. Stacy worked for me at Coburn's. Her sister Kayla did. And her grandmother did. I hate this. It was avoidable. There's notices were sent out regarding this. I wish I could blink and it went away. We're spending a lot of time talking about what's wrong and what's right, and unfortunately, there's a violation in front of us. And am I going to make it with my head or with my heart? That's a tough decision. So that's all I've got to say for now.
Mr. President, I think we really got to look at what's going on within this city right now. We got a lot of projects going on. How are we going to be able to function without a capable engineer doing this? I think we can do something and still maintain the employment of a good employee, but maybe we just need to sit down and look at what does Mr. Kimmin got to do, does he need to do to keep that position? I don't know. It's hard. We got a lot of things going on with that needs engineering stuff. We just approved a bunch of money for wastewater. We're doing a Highway 27 project. How are we going to get through that stuff without having somebody comparable sitting over at that desk? We should really look at some type of compromise of what can we do, what can he do to fulfill, to eliminate this issue with the, from what I heard, in just a couple of months, he can sell off that stock and get out from underneath that. I don't know if he can roll over his 401k from there into the PIRA program or whatever. What are some of the options? And I know we got to still think about what happens at the professional engineers. Something goes on there. The other thing we have to look at is just and sufficient cause, because if it ends up in arbitration, are we going to lose, and what kind of money is that going to cost us?
In my thoughts, Mr. President, the Code of Ethics is where a lot of it stands right now. If this thing was turned over to the engineering firm and they looked at it as a violation where they're going to pull his engineering license, it kind of tells us what our decision has to be at that point. And they would be the ones that would show if this is a violation or not, because they have their rules, they have their people that look at this. I feel if it was left into their hands and get the results from there is where I'd feel the most comfortable.
Mr. President, that could be part of the process. That could be contingent upon his employment. That he has to maintain that licensure in order to maintain that position. So is there a way that we can work through that process?
There might be. Your comment about all of our projects, that is very true, but that is a totally separate issue.
I would agree with that, Mr. President, and I would, I wouldn't be truthful if I said that didn't, factor into my thinking, but I am able to separate that from what's going on. There's a few issues in my 4+ years that I've spent a lot of time on, and they are the DeRozier Drive project, this sewer plant, and actually the hiring process for the city administrator, all of which have ties in this room right now. And I just say that because I looked over the recommendation packet we got at great length, and there's a couple things that I want to say. The arrangement that we have as a city for Greg Kimmon's services as the engineer, I feel are between us and him. And to a certain degree, I don't want to dismiss it, but the code of conduct with the professional engineers is off. I consider that almost side noise. They have a board of directors that need to feel like they, have something to do, and so they write up this big laundry list of stuff, and then somebody later on down the road comes up with something, they keep adding to it, and it grows and grows and grows. I understand there's a risk in the license factor here and being able to continue that, but the code of conduct, that's between Greg Kimmon and the PE board and that process. To me, if the license goes away, well, that's an issue that we're going to have to deal with if we come to that bridge. I read over the emails. I like to golf and I like to tinker in my garage. Greg Kimmon apparently likes to play the stock market, and I'll echo what Raquel said. Other than one email saying, oh, we might have a perceived conflict of interest here at the very end, there's no mention of SEH. I can't remember which project. I did mention to Greg, I don't know if he remembers which one, but I did ask have we gotten anything competitive regarding this, and it was, I understand the scope of the work they do, and this is the best fit. And I would completely understand that, being a former employee, he's going to know the capabilities of the place that he worked at. He's going to have relationships and contacts there that I would see benefiting us as a municipality, not working to our detriment. And then to go on further, I also agree, I don't see anything where he worked or altered anything for personal gain. In fact, I think when we were talking about the sewer plant, if he didn't, he probably came very close to burning some bridges that can't be rebuilt. Hopefully those have been restored, because I've enjoyed working with the SEH people. And in fact, if you remember, when we go back to deliberating that, and Mr. Gushik alluded to it, he actually worked contrary to that. And when we were talking about that, Greg mentioned, hey, I'm a taxpayer here too. I'm looking for the best deal for the city. The intent to organize, I guess I was looking for the time frame clarification. I got that. I guess if I was served a letter, I might take the same action too, looking to protect myself. So I just don't see a lot here. Like we do on resolutions and stuff typically before we vote, I mean, people will voice their opinion. It would be my desire to retain the services of Mr. Kimmin.
Mr. President, if I can ask a question too here. If we choose not to dismiss Mr. Kimmin, then what happens? I'm looking at, does he continue his employment? The working conditions, the morale. I have nothing against what he's done. I mean, as far as what he's brought to me and what we've worked on and stuff like that. But I'm looking at, if we choose not to dismiss, what happens? What happens with the morale? Are we going to be able to have a decent working relationship so that we can get things done here? And what are the ramifications? If we choose not to dismiss, can the professional engineers come back and take a look at this and then, I don't know, revoke his license or whatever else? That, I mean, I agree that there's two different things going on here. There's a code of ethics type of thing, and then what he's doing here. So if we choose not to dismiss, could the professional organizations come back and say, hey, you broke the code of ethics, you cannot work here, we revoke your license? I mean, I just need a little more clarification on that.
Yep, so one related to the state board's authority. They have authority over PE licensure, so not directly employment, which means they decide who gets their PE license and if individuals will lose that license and or can maintain it. In addition, if an individual does not have their PE license, they can't do professional engineering work. So in a hypothetical world, the board's authority, if they found misconduct and it's the action we wanted to take, they could strip a PE of their licensure, and therefore that person could not do PE work. So if you had a City of Little Falls employees, in this case, they wouldn't have their licensure, which is required for the job, and they couldn't do PE work. So they don't directly say, City of Little Falls, you can or can't employ that individual. All they can say is, well, if you happen to employ an individual, you just can't have them do PE work because they don't have their PE license. So that's the authority of the board. You, as a city council, are the only ones who could decide what happens with his employment. One, whether he stays employed. Then two, if so, do you want to take some personnel action that you feel is warranted? And three, as part of the personnel actions, you can consider, all right, what conditions have to be satisfied while he's employed. So technically as of today, to step back, yes, he has his PE licensure, Mr. Kimmin, and he can do PE work. So only the board can dictate those two things. But again, you need to decide, and I would like to clarify from my labor employment perspective is, we weave in state statute, much like we do for officers, state statute, Minnesota rules, because in our world, that does set what the standards are of an employee. So we can't say just because innocuously they didn't violate a city standard, there was no wrongdoing. We have to, again, look at the statute and rules and ethics that govern them. And if they violate them, you all get to determine, does that matter to his employment or not? Or you can take the approach, well, that's up, for example, for an officer, that's up to the post board. But based on my practical experience, usually we say, well, the law and the rules set standards we expect you to follow as a City of Little Falls employees. But you all get to weigh that. So back to your point, if he stays employed, he still has his PE licensure, that's up to the board. He can still do PE work. But then the issue for you is, what you're all weighing tonight is, he still has 1,700 shares of stock in SEH. It's the value of that stock, and therefore personal financial gain for Mr. Kimmin is dependent on SEH revenue and profits. So then you all got to decide, well, what do we do about that if he's employed, related to the stock issue and his involvement with working with SEH, recommending them. Now, again, if you want to go that route, we could talk, all right, technically, what do we do? But I'm saying, I think from not only a code of conduct standpoint or workplace standards, from a practical standpoint, you have a perception of a conflict of interest. You should probably get proactive and try to fix it if you're going to keep him employed. So that's discussion you can have tonight. Either if he stays employed, what mechanisms are you going to have in place to make sure there is no conflict of interest?
Mr. President? As I mentioned earlier, in policy 16, the discipline stating, it says that city employees shall be subject to disciplinary action for failing to fulfill their duties and responsibilities, including observance of all work rules, which is the perceived conflict of interest. This talks about disciplinary action, not termination of employment. And since tonight was the first time I even saw any evidence that he actually did own SEH stocks, but he would not be subject to termination. He would be subject to disciplinary action according to this rule in this letter.
In every employee handbook I've ever read, dismissal is a disciplinary action.
Okay.
And that's correct. Now, again, I know you're reliant on the quote in City Administrator Rademacher's letter, the portion of that, but Policy 16, the discipline policy, does provide that dismissal is a form of discipline.
Okay. My next thought is, if we don't terminate Mr. Kimmin's employment tonight, and he does stay with us, my question is, has SEH been paid for this last project yet? Because if they have not, perhaps we could wait to pay them until Mr. Kimmin divests of his interest in the company.
Council President, I could answer that. I believe the final payment was approved in the bills earlier tonight.
Okay.
Well, Mr. President, if there's no more questions, I'm ready to make a motion.
I'll second it.
Well, we need to know what the motion is.
I just
second, but
I'm easy tonight.
But I'm going to make, if we're ready to do that, I'm going to make a motion that we retain Mr. Kimmin, but under some actions that he's going to have to follow to retain his position. And we can discuss those after. I'd like to make sure that the council is on board. That first we're going to retain them, then we can discuss the actions that we wish to go for him to follow or to keep his employment.
Question, Mr. President, does this require a 5/8 vote?
I have no idea.
It should be just a simple majority.
So 5/8.
Members present.
Simple majority of the members present.
Yep.
In this instance,
Okay,
the
so
members present.
Wayne's,
4.
he's not part of it, okay.
So his absence doesn't count as a no vote, or it does?
It does not count as a no vote, only on ordinances and resolutions.
Okay, thank you.
Well, now I'll second it.
But in my eyes, the motion is incomplete.
Mine too.
Where are you seeing it's incomplete?
Well, the reason I didn't put stipulations into it, because if we're not going to vote to retain him, then why do we discuss or include any stipulations? I feel the first step is to decide as a council, are we going to retain him? And then we can look at what the stipulations are for that retainment. And then it would be up to him to agree to those stipulations or resign his position. Then if that's the case, then then there's no further action that needs to go.
I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. I think the motion should include the stipulations.
I agree.
I think it should.
Well, you can always amend my motion. That's your option.
If we proceed the way we were going to, except you have a motion on the table already, I have a motion. It has been prepared for us by Mr. Fitzsimmons that we could go through. It's different than yours, but it could be voted up or it could be voted down. And then we could proceed with the next question if it's voted down of what to do.
Well, now we have a motion
But
and a
now we have
second on the table. Do we have to vote on that first?
Can you rescind his motion?
Or he could rescind it. Either way.
Okay. In the interest of all parties, I will rescind my motion for the time being to listen to any other motions that will be presented.
Then if that's okay, I'm going to proceed with what Mr. Fitzsimmons has prepared for us. So we're following.
Do I have to second that? I rescind my
Am I giving you the
motion
correct
also.
last name? I'm sorry.
The second also needed to be rescinded, but I believe Mr. Goshek.
I will rescind my motion too.
Then I'll proceed so we're following our correct document. Members, I would entertain a motion to the effect that Mr. Kimmon be dismissed from employment with the City of Little Falls effective April 15th, 2019, for but not limited to the reasons stated in City Administrator John Rademacher's letters to Greg Kimmon of April 10th and 11th, 2019. That this meeting be deemed as the only appropriate hearing for Greg Kimmon to respond to the City Council, to City Administrator John Rademacher's letter to Greg Kimmon of April 10th and 11th, and that the city administration provide Greg Kimmon with any appropriate notices related to this decision.
Can you read that again?
Sure. I'll read the first part that would be the motion. And this would be what I would entertain if somebody would make a motion. That Greg Kimmon be dismissed from employment with the City of Little Falls effective April 15th, 2019, for but not limited to the reasons stated in City Administrator John Rademacher's letters to Greg Kimmon of April 10th and 11th, 2019. And we would need a motion and a second.
And then, Mr. President, you should add 2 and 3 as part of one motion.
Okay.
Yeah.
That this meeting be deemed as only appropriate hearing for Greg Kimmon to respond to the City Council, to City Administrator John Rademacher's letters to Greg Kimmon of April 10th and 11th, 2019. That City Administration provide Greg Kimmon with any appropriate notices related to this decision. Is there a motion?
Yeah, I'll make a motion.
Is there a second?
I'll second it.
Any other discussion? Would you call the roll, please?
Is it a resolution?
He can call for a roll call vote. He can call for a roll call
Oh, we
vote.
need to for this.
Okay.
Sorry, I gotta find my slip.
I was last. Or first, last.
Are we going to open this up for any discussion?
We can have discussion first.
So what we're voting on right now is the dismissal of Greg Kimmon from the City of Little Falls, correct?
Correct. That's what the motion was.
Hurkok,
No?
Storley,
No.
Hanson,
No.
Gushik,
No.
Knopfler,
No.
Lundberg. No. Zilka.
No.
Motion fails.
Then our next step to be determined. To
Well, I
determine
guess,
what the step
I
would
don't
be.
need to make the motion to retain him because I guess we did that through that vote. So now I guess we just look at, are we going to put any stipulations on his employment?
Or that's, that it would, like a continuation of his license would be required to maintain his position.
Correct.
I
That
think
he
that
would-
probably is already the case, though.
That he would, come that 5-year term, that he relinquish his investments in SEH stocks. That maybe he roll his 401K from that group into another, some IRA or other type of retirement account.
That's a whole separate thing that's not with
That's
SEH.
Mr. President,
Oh, that 401?
we had discussed possibly for the time off to be until May 1st, and then that would roll over, or he could take it out. And then in that time, our city administrator could come up with recommendations, since he's the boss, for disciplinary for us. That shouldn't be up to us to work on it.
I just want to make sure my only concern at this juncture here is that as soon as eligible, that the stock be divested in some manner.
That's what my point was, Leif, is to.
Yes.
Right, but I mean, I don't think we need to wait. We already voted on the project.
I think that the couple weeks would be good to determine the next course of action.
That's my only point, because that
And
should come from.
to
the-
give some time to cool off a little bit, maybe. I would think it's going to be difficult working, or it's going to take some talking to figure things out.
Would there be a problem if we continued this until May 1st and then gave Mr. Rademacher a chance to discuss some disciplinary with the council, or do you see a problem with that?
So, Mr. Mayor, Mr. President, there are two ways to go about it. On one hand, if it's anything less than dismissal, the city administrator has authority just to issue things, be it a suspension, no discipline, or directives.
Okay.
On the other hand, and we can just leave it at that, and adjourn the meeting. On the other hand, you can provide some feedback, but you also have to be careful as the council directing anything less than discharge the administrator to do with his employees. So I think, so either we adjourn the meeting and City Administrator Rademacher will just take into account what you said tonight, and he has authority to do anything except dismiss an employee. Or the other option is you could give some general guidance, but in the end of the city administrator setup, he doesn't have to, if you're going to get into the weeds of what an employee does or doesn't do, he'll take that into account and do his own thing. So based, again, looking at your structure, anything less than dismissal, there's unlikely something to come back to the council with for approval. So again, you could adjourn, give general guidance. I think those are, in the end, probably your two outlets for right now.
I think John has heard us and our thoughts, and he can take care of that.
And then, Mr. President, I make a motion that we adjourn.
I'll second.
We normally don't.
But he suggested it, so we did.
All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. We're adjourned at 9:42.